Every character made in the World of Warcraft has had a humble beginning, unless you've only played on a boosted tune maybe. WoW isn't what I'd call an entirely open MMORPG, as in you can forge your own story and narrative as a player. The story of Warcraft is one that we players become a part of, but we don't really define it ourselves. Blizzard writes us in somewhere. WoW has what I'd call a world story, a greater story that shaped the direction of the game. Player characters just experience whatever parts of the narrative that are of interest. The stories that you and I share as players are just that, stories of players. This is where we talk about a wipe or a clutch victory, or a time we were ganked by a rogue and got our revenge, or hella drama between members that broke or bolstered your guild. I wanted to carefully separate the world story as defined by Blizzard from the stories that are organically made by us players. Hey, it's Soul, and this is the World of Warcraft. Today I want to talk specifically about the story of WoW and the so-called champions that we players control. Where's the story at this point? Where is it going? And if it's going where many fans think it's going, is this the best approach? Now, I want to strongly encourage viewers to keep an open mind on today's thoughts and opinions because that's all they are. These are probably unpopular opinions that I strongly feel deserve a little bit more attention for the sake of discussion and not persuasion. At worst, I'd like people to come away from this piece with a conclusion that, even if they don't agree with me at all, they at least understand where I'm coming from as an observer of the story thus far. I've been here a while, I've played some of the games, so just hear me out. World of Warcraft's champions first emerged for the most part as an unknown. Whether they enter the world on the cracked earth of the Valley of Trials, or if they're at the precipice of a demon invasion on Mardoom, they're still a person, a male or a female something with no renown nor accomplishment, save for their existing at all. But time passes, and these young adventurers grow into the world and leave their mark, usually in blood. In time, there's not a single corner of Azeroth that doesn't know their names or exploits. In Outland and alternate Draenor, there are probably whispers of a single person who slaughtered dozens of fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers or plant spawn or whatever. In time, these adventurers come to be known by what's now a very familiar moniker to players, the Champion. And by the way, as a player, this naming convention kind of sickens me, and I'd really appreciate some better and more clever programming or audio engineering that could at least address me by my class name. Anyway, as a champion of Azeroth, they grow ever closer to the politics of the Horde and Alliance leadership, and eventually become swept up in the world story. From Anchorage to the journey to Outland, to Northrend, to Deepholm, and through time and space. By the time they set foot on alternate Draenor, these champions have become more like meat grinders, leaving behind trails of humanoid, beast, demonic, and other corpses. And they're about to do it some more to alternate versions of these said beings. And by now, these champions have earned yet another title and role as Garrison Commander. And after that still, as the Burning Legion pours into Azeroth, these champions rise yet again to become leaders of their newly formed class orders, effectively replacing long story characters who once gave them quests to complete. Once, these characters or champions were unnamed troops being sent to the unknown, and now they're the ones doing the sending. It's been a long road traveled, paved with the dead and its blood. And as thanks, these champions or commanders or leaders of Azeroth have only moved forward towards the next threat. And whether its players wanted it or not, Blizzard thrusted the world story upon these characters. It's hard-coded into the world story that these champions liberated Draenor and earned their current titles as class leaders. Shifting to the world story itself, the culmination of these champions' accomplishments is just one circumstantial piece on top of the growing mountain of evidence that suggests the future of WoW will have the Butchers of Azeroth climb into the Octagon, with the likes of Ashara, N'Zoth, or the Void Lords or something. Understandably, the story has been leading up to this. Loose threads have slowly been cut, loops have been closing, and plot lines have been steadily narrowing towards an ultimate threat. This is quite the change in story from its humble beginnings when orcs battled humans for the right to survive. Despite the obvious looking direction though, does it have to go there? There's a small but growing criticism among some fans that it doesn't have to, or that in fact it shouldn't. The sentiment is that Warcraft as a story is becoming lost in a cycle of spectacle thanks to Warcraft as a game. Expansions present one threat after another that jeopardize Azeroth and must be stopped. The world is affected. Leadership is shaken. Great events take place that cause a greater change, that cause even greater events to take place, and it goes on and on. But understandably, it'd be silly to have an expansion where nothing happens. Blizzard as a storyteller has felt compelled to keep laying down the tracks because the train is ever moving forward. Non-player characters live, breathe, develop, and maybe die. Meanwhile, player characters may not die because, well, that wouldn't be good. But because the development of these characters is tied linearly to the world story, there's a widely accepted belief that this parallel can never be broken. After all, these are Azeroth's champions, and when the big bad shows up, it'd feel out of place to not take part in it. Some fans don't want this though and would rather go back to being an adventurer, helping out the local community, and facing smaller threats that are at least still no less deadly. It just doesn't feel like that can happen though, and there are fans who don't want it to either. They would argue that it wouldn't make sense having felled the Lich King and Deathwing and Archimonde to end up fighting kobolds over the biggest, baddest candle. In fact, some of these fans are looking for the quote end of WoW, the end of the final threat and a conclusion to the world story. There's a lot of existing evidence that does suggest Azeroth will take the fight to greater threats in the very near future, but those are spoilers and beyond the scope of this video, so just take my word for it that they're there. However, none of this evidence makes it absolutely clear that villains like Ashara, the Old Gods, and anything greater are a threat that will be dealt with directly, immediately, or with any finality once it's all said and done. And there's one bit of evidence to support this. Anduin, Son of the Wolf is a digital comic released in July of 2016 that foreshadows an uncertain future in the Warcraft universe. In it, Anduin Wrynn is an aged king and accompanies Velen in a possible final battle with an unknown enemy. There aren't any official statements I've found to back up if any of the events of the comic is considered canon. However, recently, events in Legion do have Anduin recover his father's sword Charlemagne from the Broken Shore. This corroborates a part of the comic where Anduin is shown to possess the iconic weapon. This doesn't fully legitimize the comic as being the direction Blizzard is taking with Anduin and Velen, but for the sake of discussion I'll explore the idea and I'll draw some conclusions. With Anduin alive and being a king, a kingdom exists, presumably Stormwind, whether it's the kingdom itself or just its people. By the time Anduin is this age, there's still this seeming threat to be faced. The wording from his monologue strongly suggests it's the Legion, so even after the events of this expansion, the threat of the Legion, or a shadow of it, persists. This strongly supports the idea that despite the many events that have taken place since the Dark Portal was first opened by Medivh, back before the first Warcraft RTS, the greater story of Warcraft still follows what I call this cosmic timeline, that is, the constant ebb and flow of conflict that occurs within the Great Dark Beyond. I'm talking about scale. After all, many years passed to address the war between the Titanforged and the Black Empire, as well as the time between the War of the Ancients and the First War. So if that's the case, if the great threats of the universe still persist 30 or 40 years after the events of Legion, how might Legion the expansion have ended, and what could happen shortly after? It's easy enough to explain that the greatest threats to the world, like the Legion and the Old Gods, are simply ever-present. Like, hey, it's been 4 winters, it's about that time for the Legion to come back and make a mess of things again. But because of that, as a game, the World of Warcraft can only handle so many visits from the same kinds of threats until it gets old. The end of all life is a trope used in so many stories and video games, but specific to a persistent game like WoW, the sense of urgency becomes significantly dulled when the only 2 outcomes to this kind of story is to win or shut down the game with a big game over message, especially when this threat occurs again and again. So if there's a fan movement to stop having to fight for the safety of the world, how would that even go about? If there's a call to stop the champions of Azeroth from becoming faction or racial leaders, or even beyond that, what can be done? Joseph Campbell is an American scholar who identified a pattern of storytelling known as the hero's journey. In so few words, the hero's journey is a kind of narrative that accounts for the main character's personal growth throughout a story, from the call to adventure, to meeting tests and conflicts, to a final ordeal and the return to normalcy. How does this relate to the champions in the World of Warcraft, who don't have much in the way of personal growth, whose narrative has thus far summed up to the conquering of every conflict presented to them? Can we somehow create an internal conflict within the champion? How do you undo the infallibility of the champion, while still letting we, the players, continue to defeat our enemies? How do you win, but lose? Legion reminds us constantly that sacrifices are made to achieve victory. Maybe, for the first time, our champions will have to make that horrific choice. At the start of Legion, the champions fought on the Broken Shore and were forced to retreat along with their factions. Thanks to their actions and a fancy artifact weapon, the broken forces of Azeroth regrouped and reformed as class orders, and then the army of the Legion fall, dedicated to driving back and defeating the Legion. At the center of these class orders are its leaders, our champions, as well as a collection of famed characters throughout WoW's history. What if, towards the end of the final Legion story, in some act of heroism or desperation, the class leaders had to sacrifice some, maybe all, of these comrades for the sake of victory? And because Blizzard writes in how they're supposed to feel about this, our champions find this to be an abhorrent, unforgivable act, even if it was necessary, and brought victory. What if, in their own sense of disgust with themselves and a questioning of worth, after so many victories, our champions found this last one to be so empty? And under the weight of this guilt and emptiness and mourning the loss of their comrades, they find themselves unworthy of their station. Can they walk away in the sort of self-exile driven by this guilt? Can they abandon their post as class leaders and relinquish their artifact to a surviving successor? Can they renounce the title of champion and embrace obscurity? Can they progress into the next chapter of Warcraft not as a champion, but as a wanderer? The easy answer is hell no, but let's explore a Legion epilogue where this happens anyway. In a world of wanderers instead of champions, the forces of Azeroth leave a horribly crippled Legion back at Argus and the Twisting Nether. Presumably without the leadership of a strong Eridar leader and a critically damaged Industry of War, it would be some time before the Legion can regroup to try again. It could be another 10,000 years like in the War of the Ancients. It could be sooner, like the future Anduin and Velen may face. But it's not likely that a Burning Legion invasion of this scale will occur for years. The more local threats of Ashara and the Old Gods are relevant, but at the same time they've been around for over 10,000 years. The Black Empire and its previous subjugation of Azeroth suggest that their threat is as imminent as Blizzard decides it to be, and maybe for a while it won't be that imminent. Without these threats, Azeroth is still a world on edge. The forces of the Horde and Alliance have endured huge losses over multiple wars up until the events of Legion, and then knocked into near irrelevance at the first Battle of the Broken Shore. They're left once again trying to rebuild. The armies of the Legionfall will have disbanded after Legion, and maybe the class orders may exist as a neutral entity. Their post-war role could be academic, not unlike the Kirin Tor or the Earthen Ring, but many of its members still pledge allegiance to their respective factions. As a whole, Azeroth is vulnerable to power shifts and the influence of extremists. The threads that bind the Horde and Alliance can barely hold together. Its citizens are trying to rebuild or relocate to a better place not touched by the Legion or Deathwing or even the Horde and Alliance. Meanwhile, somewhere out there are wanderers, scattered around in Azeroth nearly torn apart by one conflict after another. Where they walk, they leave a trail of whispers and rumors. Is that who we think it is? The former High Lord? The ex-High Priest? Why'd they walk away from their station? What are they doing all the way out here? Well gosh, maybe we didn't want to get tied down. Maybe we wanted to complete the circle, this hero's journey, and try to find an identity that the world's events wrote for us. With all this newfound freedom, what's a guy or girl to do but to sail off to a new adventure? But don't assume I'm right by any account. Share your thoughts, and stay breezy.